What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical, average American here today to react to this video here called "The EU is Turning into an Empire." The EU is turning into an empire. Is that true? I mean, what exactly does that mean? And is this a good thing? Honestly, here in the United States, we don't talk about these kinds of things. So today, I really want to check out this video by Into Europe and learn more about this. So let's take a look.
Decades after the continent-spanning European colonial empires disintegrated, could it be that another European empire is taking its place in the shape of the European Union? Well, faced with outside pressure from other countries, the institutions of the European Union are increasingly looking like and behaving like those of an empire.
An empire? So we're literally talking about an empire, like a big unified like government of Europe, or like what exactly is the definition of an empire? And i- is this something that could really happen, or we're talking about the EU, which is a group of European countries, like officially forming together, which would be pretty like unbelievable, and you would think like very powerful, but all of the countries in the European Union coming together as one to form an empire. Is that's what we're talking about?
I do think that Europe has to become a superpower so that it is taken seriously in the global stage.
That would be a game changer because the EU has long been written off as a potential global power because since its start it has been politically divided.
I mean, this just I mean, what do you what do Europeans think about this? Cuz it's like if you live in Europe, or if you're in a country that's part of the EU, do you identify as like where you're from, your country, your nation, or do you identify as European more broadly, or like would Europeans support this? Like, do you want this, or that's kind of what I'm wondering. Is this even possible?
Europe will be an economic force. It will not be a strategic, political, or military force because they can't get together.
Brussels, with decades of accumulated authority, has turned into a place not where European countries come together to make decisions, but a power center in its own right.
Europe has to learn to become a geopolitical power.
This must be Europe's independence moment.
This is Europe's moment. We are in an era of rearmament.
Wow. It's interesting because, funny enough, for Americans, we think of Europe as one place, honestly, which I know is like a little insulting because Europe is a continent, but it's made up of many different cultures and places and countries and languages, and that's something that's really amazing about Europe. Um, but I can also see where that is a big strength, but it also would make it difficult, like what they're saying, for all of the EU countries, for all of Europe to be unified under one what? Government? Like ruling body? Isn't that kind of the point of the EU? Is this suggesting that it takes it further? I'm a little confused what this is even trying to suggest for the EU.
The institutions of the European Union are shifting to majoritarian rule, giving EU politicians more wiggle room to craft joint policies. And the direction of travel is now unmistakable. The EU's power is growing. it plays a bigger and bigger role in the internal politics of its member states, enforcing its own vision of how the world should be, including on the capitals that resist. And
Yeah, they're talking about like centralizing power of the EU. Like right now, don't all of the EU countries have to like agree and vote in order to get things done and to pass things? And that's the point, right? Every country like gets a say. Whereas this is saying the EU is starting to lean towards just like simplifying that process, or would that be fair, or would that be representative of what everyone in Europe wants? This seems like a very complicated problem, honestly. I didn't even know that this was even a consideration.
And despite its reluctant members trying to keep the lid on the EU's power, external threats are pushing the EU closer together. It seems possible that an empire is now slowly emerging, not from ambition, but as a response to threats it would not otherwise survive.
Empire is a strong word, by the way. Empire. Europe, EU, European Empire. Certainly like sounds big and powerful, and like I was saying, a lot of Americans think of Europe as one thing, but it's obviously not. But if it was, maybe logistically that would make things simpler in some ways. Or they're arguing that if Europe was unified into one empire, I don't know what that would look like, but it would make it so Europe is more powerful in ways. I think that's what they're saying.
So has the EU breached its empire containment, and is it now on the road to becoming an empire and a great power in its own right?
Really?
Well, here's the thing. The EU was specifically designed not to be an empire. After centuries of European countries trying to dominate their neighbors, the founding fathers of the EU built a system that would stop any one power center in the European Union from dominating the others.
That's what I thought too. I thought that was the point, that the EU is constructed so that everybody gets a say. It's on purpose that there's no one singular power, right? That's what I thought.
Instead of war, differences were resolved through negotiation and democracy. It created a system where European countries could resolve their differences peacefully and basically couldn't go to war with one another. The core principle was a political philosophy called functionalism, and later neo-functionalism. Basically, it meant binding countries together so tightly through trade that breaking apart became structurally impossible, and that one day out of this collaboration, a common European identity would emerge.
I mean, this is really interesting, especially from an American point of view, because we don't learn a ton about European history, certainly not in any of this kind of detail, or let alone the relationships between all the European countries and how you guys have gotten to where you are today. But so this is really interesting to like understand like how the identity of Europe was kind of formed, and what the reason for all of this and the reason for the EU being created, what all that is for. So this is actually very informative.
So the EU was initially a small set of rules that regulated these bonds between countries, and a democratic body to settle disputes. While this expanded over time, encompassing more and more aspects as the bond between countries became deeper, that initial logic remained the same: regulate interactions between countries without intervening too much in their other affairs. But
so this makes it sound like the purpose of all this is really for all the European countries to get along, you know, in a positive way, not for all the European countries to collectively merge together and become just the Empire of Europe. That doesn't seem to be what the original purpose was.
But that initial philosophy has left the EU fragmented and divided. Many of the policy items that would be needed for it to become an empire, even smaller pieces of legislation, like tax policy, cross into the domain of national sovereignty. Recently, EU Inc. showcased the limits of its model. It was supposed to be a 28th regime, a single federal corporate framework that would let any European company incorporate as a European identity rather than a national one to standardize rules. Simple enough, right?
Wow.
Well, that is until you start asking questions about who taxes those companies and who has authority over them.
Oh, I see. So, man, Europe is just like fascinating. And it's something that we don't really talk about or think about a lot here in the United States, to be honest. But it's like, Europe is really cool. Like, I think one of the reason here in the US we are so sheltered and ignorant of a lot of things is because we're just the United States. I mean, there is Canada, which is very similar in many ways, and Mexico, but that's really kind of it. And most Americans just don't even travel outside the US, so we're not exposed to any of this other stuff. In Europe, it's like all these different cultures and people and philosophies and ways of life all and it's amazing, and it obviously like shapes how you think about the world. And but I can see where it would be very, very, very difficult to get all of that into one unified cohesive thing, entity that works perfectly. That sounds very difficult. It's amazing that you've done this well with the EU.
And so what landed instead was 27 pieces of fragmented legislation with companies still registered nationally with some harmonization.
Like he's talking about how it's difficult to create a company that can service all of Europe because it depends on where it's formed and like logistical things like that, where I can see where there's some things where you wish it was like all of Europe rather than just your country.
Leaving most people disappointed and not tackling the initial problems it was meant to solve. That's because the decision-making power still rests with individual countries, which limits the scope and effectiveness of what the EU can actually do.
I see.
Unlike
Empires.
actual empires, like the United States, China, or Russia, the EU has very few ways to force its constituent subunits to stick together and act as one. You see, empires use carrots and sticks to punish and reward their constituent parts. There are many different carrots and different sticks. There's the military, there's legal and bureaucratic means, there's financial patronage system, and ideological frameworks. The ideological framework will tell the population what to believe, the legal framework will tell you what your responsibilities are and what you have to do, the financial tool will give you rewards through a financial system to make sure you stay happy and on board, and finally the military will protect you from enemies, but also try to put down rebellions if you, for example, try to leave the empire.
It is extremely complicated. That Europe is made up of so many countries, but I keep saying, isn't that what makes Europe like really amazing as well? I guess the problem that some European countries have is that you are small and you can't really be a global empire influencing the global trade and technology, and that's difficult when you're small. So this is like saying if all the EU countries like merged into one empire, that alone would increase the power. I mean, it's true, like together with anything, like together you are strong and separate you are weaker. But I just feel like don't all the EU countries have individual identities that and governments, right? That just make it very difficult to do this.
Now, carrots and sticks don't mean your country is a democracy or a dictatorship, since both systems use carrots and sticks. But they just do it in different ways.
We do not think that it has to be something like a draconian and autocratic organization. It can be democratic, but at the same time, it can be powerful, and part of its power can be to project the values of democracy that it takes very seriously.
Yeah, you gotta be kind of careful about this. when you're talking about an empire. Again, that's an interesting word, empire. Europe, your EU empire. Because it does make it sound like tyrannical, or like, is there one leader, or how does that? I mean, people are talking about this and they're saying like it can be based on democracy and like your broad European values that everyone agrees on. Like, I guess that would be the correct way to do it.
when it comes to the EU institutions and when it comes to the member states as well.
Empires like the United States, China, and Russia have a lot of carrots and sticks to go around. The United States, for example, is a federal system. It gives states autonomy, but the commander-in-chief is the president. The federal government has tax-raising abilities to fund a bureaucracy and agencies whose standards apply to the whole country.
That's a good analogy. The United States, like we are 50 different states, but we are all American, and we are all under one federal government, and it works. But to be honest, Americans can be different depending on where you are. You know, different states can be quite different, but not that different, if I'm being honest. Like, an American in California is not that different from an American in Florida or Maine or Illinois or something. Whereas in Europe, like, France is very different to like Germany or the UK, right? Like, it's very different. So being an empire is much easier for like the US, China, Russia. It's quite a difficult task, this idea for Europe.
And its federal legal system to which everybody is accountable, which firmly puts the federal government at the top. The Chinese system is a little bit different. It's a stronger unitary state where everybody is accountable to the Chinese Communist Party. It has a centralized tax system, meaning that no rival power centers can emerge. Russia is different again. It has a strong centralized security service, as well as a personal patronage system where regional power centers and power brokers pledge their fealty to the central government and to the men at the top,
Jeez.
Vladimir Putin. But the EU is different. It isn't an empire, and a lot of the sticks and carrots are in the national capitals. It has no military to enforce its will directly, its budget is small, it doesn't raise its own taxes, and it has a limited say on ideology, where it does not control schools, media companies directly. And it can't take many decisions without unanimity from its member states, putting the EU in many cases below the member states in terms of power dynamics. But that hasn't stopped the EU from becoming more powerful over the past decades.
That's what I was thinking. The EU has a voice. It seems to be a very powerful entity. It just has problems that I didn't know about. You know, as an American, I didn't know about this stuff. I just can't. What do Europeans think about this idea? I'm really curious about that, because it's like I can have an opinion on it as an American and be like, oh, that sounds good or bad, but it's like it's really Europeans who need to decide if this is this acceptable? Is this good?
Through successive crises, the EU has undergone empire creep and slowly gathered more carrots and sticks.
Oh, so the EU has already been, you know, leaning towards becoming an empire, like slowly. Like, there are little things with the EU that are already kind of like an empire. Really?
The EU's institutions have asserted themselves the most in the legal dimension. Very early on in the EU's history, EU law became accepted in national courts and placed above national law through landmark court cases. The extension of qualified majority voting at every successive treaty round through the Single European Act, the Maastricht, Amsterdam, and Nice and Lisbon Treaty has expanded the list of policy areas decided by a majority rather than unanimity, eroding the national veto. But of course, keeping red lines with unanimity for foreign and security policy, defense, taxation, the EU's own resources, and treaty change.
So there are things where legally, the EU has more power than like an individual country in the EU? There have been court cases decided in favor of the EU over like the local or individual country.
The move to the euro, the financial crisis, and the Greek euro crisis in 2015 saw the EU get new powers to inspect national budgets before national parliaments, and important budgetary rules like the Stability and Growth Pact, instauring a debt and deficit rule.
I didn't know about this. The EU has more power over individual member countries than I realized. I didn't know about this.
While that rule is mostly ignored, it does give the EU negotiating power to deal with members on a per-case basis. There have also been some small moves on the military dimension with the growth of Frontex, the EU's border force, which is basically an embryonic army, and for ideology through cultural initiatives backed by the EU, but also through continent-wide media monitoring mandated by the European Digital Services Act. In fact, recent crises and international pressure have given the EU even more sticks to play with. The Green Deal and the reaction to the US's Inflation Reduction Act means the EU now coordinates industrial policy. COVID exposed supply chain dependence and justified the first ever common debt. Russia's war broke the energy model of the EU and opened the door to joint defense procurement.
Yeah, the EU does a whole lot more than I realized. The EU has a lot more power than I realized.
State aid rules and opened the door for another 90 billion euros in common borrowing for Ukraine. US threats against Denmark and Greenland have seen a push for more European defense procurement to the loss of the US, coordinated in part by the EU. And to deal with individual member states' vetoes on key policies, it has pursued a so-called multi-speed Europe, with enhanced cooperations becoming the norm to operate. But
So right now, or at least in the past, you had to have a lot of the EU member countries agree and coordinate together. But recently it's becoming more like even if there are some countries that disagree, um the EU can like kind of overrule that, which does sound much more like a unified like single governing body rather than like dozens of different countries all voting on something and getting an equal say. Like especially when the EU thinks there's something very important that has to happen, it can just like there's ways to just make it happen even if not everybody agrees. That's starting to sound much more like one single entity or empire rather than a bunch of different countries like all trying to collectively agree, which is very difficult. So I see why this has happened. Is that a good thing?
But even without new initiatives, the EU's existing carrots and sticks, especially the economic and political ones, are starting to be worth a lot more, because the EU has turned into a continent of rule breakers. Rules that were agreed by all of the EU countries to avoid any one of them drifting too far off financially or far away from the EU's ideas of a liberal democracy, gave the EU institutions the power to intervene to suspend voting rights or payments to individual countries. Southern Europe was particularly targeted by the terms of the financial rules, while Central and Eastern European countries in terms of the rule of law mechanisms. For net recipients of EU money, the EU budget represents 2 to 3% of GDP. They can defy on small things, but not sustainably on big things. The EU core, with France and Germany, historically has been doing quite well, and they were relatively immune from many of the EU's rules because their economies were larger and stronger, and they have significantly more voting power, meaning the EU's threats had little effect on them. But today, even Germany, which was a beacon of stability and sound public finances, is seeming a lot less immune to the EU sticks.
Wow. That I guess I'm just kind of like surprised that like the EU is a lot closer to this unified empire than I thought. And also this is just also talking of like it's making me understand how incredibly complicated and difficult it is to make a group, a continent like Europe, which wants to work together, but also maintain your individual national identities at the same time, I assume. How difficult this all is, and how it gets a little messy trying to figure this all out and make everyone happy. You can't make everyone happy. Um, it's a very difficult, complicated problem that, again, here in the United States, I didn't even know about this. We never talk about or hear about this.
In fact, Germany's government deficit jumped to roughly 4.75% of GDP in 2026, comfortably above the EU's 3% ceiling, largely because of higher defense spending and as part of a rearmament campaign for Russia and to fight deindustrialization. This puts it at risk of an excessive deficit procedure by the European Union for the first time. Currently, only the Netherlands, Sweden, Ireland, and Denmark have the same public finances and are net contributors to the EU. But with aging populations, high energy prices, overregulation, and competition from China in many key economic sectors, many European countries are likely to face additional economic struggles in the future, exposing them to the EU sticks in the form of the excessive deficit procedure.
So, is the overarching idea here that, like, coming together into more of an empire, a European empire, could solve a lot of the problems that some European countries are having? Or maybe that, like, all European countries want to have more power and influence on the world stage, but that's difficult. But Europe has this option to collect, to join together all these different countries. It's just a matter of how far are you willing to go with that to become a superpower.
And carrots because the EU has to allow member states to give support to their economy in the form of state aid. Politically, we've also seen the birth of EU patronage networks, and even punitive measures against ideologically non-compliant politicians. For example, the EU threatened to withdraw Italy's COVID bailout funding until Giorgia Meloni adopted a more pro-EU tone.
Wow.
This has even been used to push ideology, with EU's corruption and rule of law probes aimed mainly at nationalist candidates and politicians across the EU.
So the EU is actively using its stick to encourage EU member countries to be more complicit? Is that what's happening? Like the people in charge of the EU want more power, more cooperation, and they're not afraid to encourage certain countries to do that, or that's what it sounds like.
While neglecting similar violations in countries like socialist and pro-EU Spain, which have equally pressing media freedom and judicial reforms. Now, this accumulation of power hasn't been without pushback. There have been notable court cases in Germany pushing back against joint EU bonds, or in Poland against the primacy of EU law.
So there are countries in the EU who push back against, like, it having so much power.
Both of those rulings have been cited by member state governments looking for cover when they want to push back against Brussels. The legal and bureaucratic tool is the tallest pillar the EU has built and the one the most under attack. But at the same time, policies like EU Inc. are still failing to centralize power, and member states like the Frugal Four are trying to prevent the EU from raising its own taxes. But even then, the pushback is far more limited today, especially since Brexit, when even sovereignist politicians know they can no longer credibly call for exiting the EU. And so now EU countries are in the same boat, where more legislation gets passed at the EU level, giving the EU ever more carrots and sticks to tell them what to do.
So the EU is slowly gaining enough power to kind of steer it in this empire direction. So is this just inevitable? Because it sounds like the EU is slowly heading that direction of more unified, more jurisdiction, more the EU governing body having more power. And it's sounding more like just the government of the EU, the European empire, the European government. It's slowly going in that direction?
So will the EU actually finish the job and become an empire?
Yeah.
Well, here it's perhaps best to look at how the EU has applied its newfound leverage on what was formerly its most troublesome member, Hungary. Under Viktor
Okay.
Orban, Hungary created an illiberal democracy. Using an electoral supermajority, he stacked the country's institutions by modifying the constitution 15 times. He used all of that to enrich his closest political allies, including with EU funds, all the while campaigning against the EU on policies related to immigration, LGBT, and aligning with Russia by blocking EU aid packages to Ukraine.
This is just something that in the United States, we don't know anything about this Hungary situation with Viktor Orban or being pretty anti-EU or yeah, this is something like I really had no idea about.
While receiving cheap energy imports. As a result, the EU had effectively sanctioned the country, initially trying to suspend its voting rights under Article 7, and when that didn't work, with it not finding the necessary 26 votes, it instead moved to use the rule of law conditionality mechanism passed in 2021, which suspended funds worth 15% of Hungary's annual GDP.
I mean, this is an example of a country in the EU who doesn't agree with what the EU's doing. And the EU is just kind of able to get its stick out and beat it into submission. Now maybe most of the EU members are okay with this, but it definitely shows how like most countries in the EU are starting to conform to this empire sort of idea, or this was kind of like the outlier, the dissenter.
The conditionality mechanism that deprived Hungary of EU funds due to democratic backsliding and rule of law transgressions, and the bad economic figures that it resulted made it much more difficult for Viktor Orban to persuade the public that they are running good governance.
This deprived Hungary of the means to maintain its expensive patronage system and was a contributing factor in the fall of Viktor Orban. And when
So were most Europeans like happy that about the fall of Viktor Orban and Hungary and like getting a new government, or are most people happy about this because they're like the one outlier?
Peter Magyar won the 2026 election with a supermajority enabled by Hungary's winner-takes-all electoral system, the EU delivered a list of 27 super milestones that Hungary would need to fulfill to recover the money, which involved restoring the rule of law. But they also pressured Hungary to allow a 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine to go through.
I mean, it just goes to show you, like, the EU has a lot of power over its members. Like, if the EU is upset with you, they have a lot of power to, like, take away your budget, uphaul your government. Like, that. Maybe it's working as it's meant to be. Maybe this is working as it's designed, or it's interesting, though. As an American, from an outside point of view, it's fascinating to see. We can relate a little bit with our 50 states, and the federal government of the United States looming over them. It's kind of, there's some similarities, but these are, states are one thing. These are individual countries in the EU.
As a gesture in that direction, Peter Magyar campaigned to have Hungary join the European Public Prosecutor's Office to make Hungarian politicians accountable for misspending EU funds. What's more noticeable is that this is an enhanced cooperation agreement that Hungary had initially opted out of. This both threatens Orban and his followers for misappropriating funds, but also serves as a gesture of good faith towards the EU in hope to unlock the blocked funds. In other words, in the Hungarian case, the EU's carrots and sticks were powerful enough to nudge the country back on track, according to the EU. If the Hungarian case is anything to go by, it seems that the EU can now impose its rules and will on its smallest member states.
Yeah.
And measures that were previously optional are slowly being rolled out more widely.
Yeah. I guess you just have to be careful about this kind of stuff. Maybe everyone in Europe is happy about all this, but it certainly shows that the EU has a lot of power over especially smaller EU countries.
It could also mean that a tipping point is nearing where the EU acquires enough power that it starts to snowball and centralization becomes inevitable, even if it might need more time to enforce its rules on its biggest and richest member states. But what do you think? Are we close to that point, or does the EU need more crises and empire creep to strengthen the EU further compared to the capitals before it starts to snowball? Will EU countries which seem headed for nationalist governments in the next 5 years go along with the empire, or will the pushback against it intensify? And if the EU centralizes further, will it also then use its new unity to project power abroad like other empires? These are all questions for future videos, but in the meantime, let me know what
Wow. It's a lot to think about, and it's honestly something that I didn't even know was happening. But there's a lot of things happening in Europe, the EU, that I didn't know about. A lot of decisions, perhaps an entire power change. The Empire of Europe, or the EU Empire, whatever, however you want to call it, um, certainly sounds like something that would maybe change the world. It's just hard to even think that this could really be a thing or what it would really look like, but they kind of laid out a lot of examples of how the EU is slowly going in that direction. It's interesting. I'm curious what Europeans think about all this, if this is a good thing, if this is what is best for Europe, or like they said, a lot of countries in Europe struggle with certain things, especially on the global scale, or and in a unified empire of Europe, maybe that would be the next global superpower to surpass the United States, or especially if we're declining and Europe is starting to rise into empire status. And who knows? I didn't even know this was happening. It's a lot to think about, and trying to understand if this could really happen. But I was glad to watch this. This was fascinating, and something we, like, most Americans have no idea about. So this was cool. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, feel free to give this video a like or leave a comment, especially if you're a European and you have thoughts about all this. That'd be awesome to hear about. And if you're interested in more videos like this, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.